as I want to be. And so with this, let me just begin by saying that my work in IIT Bombay is in the Department of Physics, but my work is in quantum information theory, which is an interdisciplinary area which intersects computer science, electrical engineering, mathematics, and has applications all the way to biology and finance and so on and so forth. So you're rightly placed in this lecture. You're rightly placed, at least with respect to the question, because this is one of the so-called disruptive technologies. It's a technology that essentially is so fundamental in what it's doing that it has the capacity to basically affect all possible other areas of industrial activity and academic activity. So with that, let me bring you to the title of the talk today. So I want to simply ask a question, which I think is already a very sophisticated question to ask, which is, what is the limits of the technology around us, right? So to answer this question, I really have to ask a series of motivated questions, and then I'll transition over to something that looks technical. But for almost the first half, I hope to basically simply entertain you with things that are much closer to our everyday parlance in terms of conversation. So what the deeper question, the subtitle is basically the physical foundations of technology and its ultimate quantum limits. So what I mean by that is basically that the things that we consider, that we use on a daily basis, have principles of physics underlying them. And if you push on those principles of physics, sometimes you get very interesting new technologies that emerge, whose classical analogs we are quite well aware of, and which provide very clear advantages in comparison to basically the old technology. Sometimes you don't, and to know the difference is essentially half the game. Okay, so with this, let me just begin by motivating a definition of technology that I will use throughout the rest of this lecture, because sometimes these words are nebulous in our minds, and what it means is something that we would want to be very clear on. So for the purposes of this talk, I've constructed this kind of informal definition, which is that it's methods and machinery developed by human beings for potential human betterment. So it's technology because it's artificial, it's something that is man-made, human-made, and it is for human consumption, or for at least the manipulation of the world around us for human betterment, at its with whatever narrow definition human betterment has. So in this context, let me get right to the most, I think, basic example, which is cooking. So when you think of cooking, you don't think of I don't know if you expected to hear about cooking in a quantum lecture today, but here we are. Cooking is actually one of my big hobbies. So I'm very excited to talk to you about cooking, offline and online. But also I'm very happy to insert cooking into any other conversation that I can get myself to. So think of cooking as a technology primitive. So about 1 million years ago, based on archaeological evidence, basically human beings, Cro-Magnon, our ancestors at some point started actually heating food. So applying heat as a technology to the raw food that is available around them in nature. Now, what cooking does specifically as a technology, if I'm thinking about cooking, I have to ask, what does this technology do for me? What did it do for me that I didn't have before? And what it did was actually it unlocks the nutrients and makes them bioavailable, because it breaks them down into simpler, more easily digested biological material, and this causes the uptake of those nutrients to increase, which of course increases the total amount of nutrition that we were consuming, given that we were in some mixture of hunting and gathering, which means that we had very scarce resources in front of us as a civilization. Now, so again, I'm taking a view which is perhaps a very a restrictive view, a technology view, but thinking of technology, the cooking as a technology, I can ask, what's the benefit? How did it benefit me? Right, going back 1 million years, how did it benefit? How could I sell it to the ancient Cro-Magnon man that he or she should actually use cooking? And the simplest answer is, well, the most ultimate benefit of it was perhaps the growth of the human brain itself. That we were just having so much more food available to us that it caused basically a translation in just a transition in just the way our brain capacity improved, and hence ultimately perhaps is one of the causal factors for where we are today. The cost of it is depends on where you are and so on and so forth. But something that's roughly like the need to gather firewood, right? So stated this way, for something as simple as cooking, there doesn't seem to be very much. I don't seem to have added anything to the conversation. Well, it's all I've said is, well, it's great to cook food, which I think all of us agree. And I said, well, there's a little bit of work that you have to do to cook food, which is you need to gather the firewood, maybe set it on fire. And we all agree that the costs are acceptable in comparison to the magnificent benefits that are in front of us. So, but let me also introduce you to a subtlety in the way that thinking about technology brings up. This is another form of cooking in front of you. So this is actually a Latin American dish that perhaps some of you recognize immediately, perhaps some others don't. It's called ceviche. I believe this one's a Peruvian version of it. And what it is to put it simply, it's cooking with chemicals. So if you take citric acid and you apply it to any food, any raw food, in this case, a delicate fish, then what happens is that the raw food is denatured in exactly the same way that heat denatures food. Both in the case of application of heat and in the case of application of chemicals, you're doing the same thing. You're breaking down the food so that you can eat it, and you can the nutrients are more bioavailable for you to digest. But the way in which you're cooking is very different in this case than it is in the other one. This is, by the by, a delicacy of Latin American cuisines, several of the Latin American cuisines. Again, the benefit is almost unnecessary to state. The cost is you might need to gather some acidic fruits, so you might need to go look up where your local citrus tree is and get some of that citrus for yourself. Again, a very paltry cost in comparison to the benefit of nutritional food. Okay, so here is a third example, and this example is of course the wheel. This is I think a toy from the Indus Valley civilization. So again, I can ask this question about what's the wheel is a technology. It's something that is man-made for the purposes of human betterment. So can you please do the SWOT analysis for me? Can you tell me? I'm very obsessed with SWOT analysis. Can you tell me exactly why I should care about this guy? And again, the benefit is straightforward. Is that it enhances the efficiency of mechanical work. So in this toy example, the wood or whatever substance it is that is in the back of the cart, the person would have to carry it on their back, and both the amount of wood that they can carry and the distance to which they can carry it is greatly enhanced by the invention of the wheel, because of course the actual efficiency of transport is enhanced. So when you pull with, let's say in this case, a bull or whatever this animal is, when you pull on the substance that you want to transport, you have basically the bull doesn't have to work that hard, which means that before the animal tires out, it can go that much farther in terms of moving the heavy load that's given to it. The cost is beginning to get complicated already, right? So, which is that you need to make some complicated structures of transport, which is you have to make a bullock cart, and then you have to go find animals. You have to, making the wheel is just one piece of basically assembling a technology, which once fully assembled gives you some benefit. But what I want to draw your attention to is the fact that we're now beginning to complicate the space of how much work we put in beforehand and how much work we get out on the back end. And this difference and this complication is essentially one of the many questions that you would ask if you're trying to construct an emerging technology, right? So look where I'm going with this, right? So I'm starting with basically technology that all of us are so familiar with that we don't barely ever think of it as technology. And it's part of kind of the civilizational fabric of the world. And as we're proceeding farther and farther, and we're trying to analyze it from the point of view of technology, what I want you to pay attention to is that we can learn lessons that we can then take and ask the same questions to technologies that are yet to exist. And that's the kind of game that I'm trying to play. Yeah. So here is another example. So this is our famous GTX Kaveri engine. And so, well, it's just a jet engine of some sort if you don't care for the details. And engines are a different variety of technology, right? They're a real leap in technology. This and the steam engine, the cousins of it which came before, represent basically our capacity to generate enormous mechanical work. And because we can now generate enormous mechanical work, we can actually really move things beyond basically man or beast, right? Having the labor input of just either human beings or our animal friends in the animal kingdom. And so the benefit is this tremendously enhanced capacity for mechanical work, which means we can have a train that just continuously moves for hundreds of miles and days and days on end without getting tired, so to speak. The cost of it is perhaps burning fossil fuels, which you would have thought of as a simple cost in the 50s, but as we will learn to realize, this is a complicated cost, and we need to actually think about it more carefully. But the engine is another example. It's in fact the exemplar of technology. I mean, engineering as a branch is named after this modest device, and so it represents a kind of fundamental shift in our capacity to manipulate the world around us for our betterment. Yeah. And again, I want you to notice that not all engines are the same. So the previous one is put in on a plane, and it allows you to fly, and so it has a certain purpose. It's trying to do something. It's trying to manipulate the air around it to generate lift. Whereas this is basically a four-stroke auto engine, which perhaps is just used to move on the floor. So this is from a Japanese National Museum. The citation is below. And so the what I again want you to notice is that when I'm thinking of technology and I'm trying to ask questions about how good is it as good as it can be, and what does it cost for me to make this technology, the answers also rely on what version of the technology I'm using. Am I talking about heat-based cooking, or am I talking about chemical-based cooking? Am I talking about engines that allow me to fly, or am I talking about engines that allow me to move on land? These are all questions that basically the devil is in the details, and these are all questions that you would have to answer very carefully before you can make an assessment of which one is better and by what amount a thing is better, and so on and so forth. Okay, and finally, I come to the kind of perhaps the kind of questions that you're here to, at least in part, listen to, which is the computer, right? So here is an example of a computer. Again, I'm not giving you the kind of the standard computer that all of us are on, but the abacus, which is a very old Sumerian technology. And here again, you can basically see that it allows you some sort of computation, and you can ask what's the benefit. The benefit is enhances the speed and accuracy of addition. I've written something here which I'll come to in a second now. And the cost, of course, is you have to build the physical device, right? So again, here let me point out to you, it doesn't look like I've done much, right? I've just somehow enumerated something that's very simple and silly about the world that we live in. I've overemphasized some aspects of our daily life, like cooking. But there are things that we can learn from this. So in this example, what I want you to pay attention to is that there are only those many slots here. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 slots here, with a little bit of additional stuff on the side. And what that means is that there is an upper limit of how large a number this can handle, right? So an abacus basically is built roughly on roughly the similar principles to binary. So what that means is that the position indicates some value of the number, and so there is an upper limit of how much this can calculate. And so enhancing the speed and accuracy of addition is yes, but up to some large number, and then you can maybe manage this by doing something, which is you can offline part of the computation, and then you can use it to do small bits of calculation. But what it does is it does enhance both the speed and accuracy, right? So kids who use abacus know this to be a tremendous tool. Again, with computers, you can ask the question, well, how do I compare an abacus which I'm using by my hand and I have to actually move and I have to learn this, the mechanics of moving the abacus? How do I compare this, the speed of an abacus against that of a microelectronics device? So something that's either a vacuum device like this, which is just here for historical reasons, or basically something that's more sophisticated like a transistor, or an integrated chip and so on and so forth, the kind of modern stuff that we are used to. So what this brings you to is the kind of standard confusion of computer scientists, but also of technologists around the world, which is that to compare computers to other computers is an example of comparing technologies to other technologies. What you have to do is you have to pay attention to the underlying physical machine changes. So, so the abacus, for instance, was a fully mechanical device that's just hand operated, whereas the this electronic device here is runs on electricity, but it's a different variety of physical device than the transistor, the solid state transistor, and then the IC chip, and all of the modern cousins of it that have come up since. But the fundamental question actually about computation does not care about this, right? If I want to add two numbers, right, that's the question that I want to answer. I want to be able to add two numbers as fast as I possibly can. How can you please tell me what the ultimate limits of the world are to do this? You have to somehow both take into account the fact that this one's an abacus and that one's a solid state computer, but at the same time, you have to somehow take this effect out of the equation, because otherwise, you'll just be talking too specifically about individual individual instances, right? So, just to give you an analogy, if I ask you which is faster, a plane or a car, the answer is of course a plane, right? But you could, if before you answered that question, if you really paused and thought about it, you could say, well, are there any additional statements here, right? Maybe my plane doesn't have fuel, maybe it doesn't have, its wheels are off, right? Maybe it's somehow not operational in some way. Maybe my car is basically a world record breaking fastest car that that you drive in the desert somewhere. What are the details, right? And so what you can do is when you answer the question that planes are faster than cars, what you're actually explaining to me is the average use case. You're saying on average, if you take about 100 working planes and 100 working cars, almost always the planes are faster than the cars. Of course, you can have like some weird instance where maybe a plane just, or maybe a plane is slow enough, like a Cessna, and then a car is fast enough that it just about beats, beats this car beats this plane. But those are not the questions that we're interested in, right? And so you have to have a way of talking about all of this, and computer science, of course, offers you a formal way of talking about all of this. And once you've done all of that is when you can compare apples to apples. So this is basically the point that I want to make to you. So one of the central points I want to make to you about asking the question about the ultimate power of technology is that to answer one, I want you to notice that there is this diversity in technology. Not all instances of a given technology that is used to solve a given problem, for instance, cooking, the problem is you're trying to make food more bioavailable, and the solution is to break down the macronutrients so that they become more bioavailable. This solution already does not express itself in some universal fashion. There is heat-based cooking and there is chemical-based cooking, and they do very different. They have very different demands, and they have very different labor costs involved, and so on and so forth. And so you would have to account for this very carefully when you make the analysis of which is better and how fast is what and so on and so forth. And so this need to compare apples to apples is a central question as you try and set up the question about comparing technologies, right? For those of you who are not in STEM but are in this lecture basically, so that you can become aware of kind of the power of quantum computing. This is the question that will be in front of you, because somebody will come and they will sell you a solution that they will say to you is better because it's quantum. And now you have to remember that you have to first normalize a lot of things before you can ask the apples to apples question, and oftentimes this may not be fully the correct answer. Okay, so this brings us right to the question, which is how to normalize different questions, right? So, so what does this sentence mean? Again, I give you an example. Is it more efficient to cook with 1 joule of heat or with 100 milliliters of citric acid, right? I mean, I can ask this question. And you can see I've put the word more efficient in quotation marks, because the entire story is the question of answering this question more efficient, right? You have to define what efficiency means in the context of cooking, right? Maybe it means, well, the amount of nutrition that I have imbibed per cost of work that I've done, right? So for 1 joule of heating, I have to pay some person some money. I think of it in the modern context, I have to go to a shop and buy a lump of coal, and I have to pay this cost of money to the shopkeeper, and the shopkeeper also happens to sell citric acid, and so I can ask them for citric acid instead. And then maybe the cost of 1 joule of heat or 100 ml of citric acid is very clear to me, and the more efficient bit is basically the amount of nutrition that's been transferred to me, which you would have to measure in some way. Okay, so you also have to ask the question how to abstract out these different questions so that you're not asking the question with this much detail in here, right? So if you go to a standard computer science class or a standard physics class, these subtle variations of our everyday lived experience are actually taken out of the equation, because that is too much variability, and more often than not does not inform the final solution that you're looking for, and so is quite irrelevant to the story basically. So but to give you a kind of very dramatic example, I can ask the question, can I compare cooking to engines? Is this even a thing that I am allowed to do, right? Maybe this is, and this is a kind of scientific abstraction that I want you to also enjoy along with me, because it's just the kind of thing that produces very, very powerful results. So let me just share with you why I think cooking and engines can be compared to each other. Engines take in some sort of so there is a hot bath, or if you want to think of it as if you have a picture of a steam engine as some guy who's standing with a lump of coal in front of an open fire that has a little lid on it, in an engine, in a train engine, that he shovels the coal in and shuts the door. Then you feed it something. You feed it a constant amount of coal, and it produces a constant amount of mechanical energy, right? Which is the actual train moving. So cooking is doing the exact same thing, which is you're giving it some energy, which is heat or chemical energy, and it produces for you some bioavailable nutrients. So I could abstract out, I could zoom out and say, hey, actually, when I think of these as these input-output processes, I input energy and it outputs something that is desirable to me. In the case of cooking, it outputs bioavailable nutrients, and in the case of an engine, it outputs mechanical energy. Well, maybe these two things are the same thing, and maybe I can compare them, right? And you can be very formal about it, and so that abstracting out of the details of citric acid over here versus firewood over there versus coal over there is actually an advantageous thing, because it tells you the kind of universal principles involved, and then you can go back and ask the question about how this affects your specific instance that you're interested in. And what about computing? Maybe you can think of computing in exactly the same terms as well, because you give computing something, right? You plug your computer into the electrical wall, and you supply it some energy, and in return it gives you something back, and what it gives you is computation. And so if you think of input and output in some fair way, maybe all of these things are the same thing. They're all input-output processes. And this kind of abstraction is very, very powerful. This is another of the kind of standard ways of thinking that you would have to go down to start this kind of conversation. And after you've asked and answered these questions is where you can ask the question, what are the ultimate limits to technology? So this is what I was sharing with you beforehand as well, which is that even to ask the question about the ultimate limits to technology, there is a lead up, there is a run up, which of course, for those of you who are scientifically trained, you know very well, some bits of this are common to our common curriculum, but again, I share this for everyone. Yeah. But before I move any further, let me just say, why do we even care about these kinds of questions, right? So the reason I care about these kinds of questions is basically because in front of your two examples that are very socially relevant right now, one is the Kudungaram nuclear plant, which is in Tamil Nadu. It's an example of a nuclear plant. I just pulled up a picture of it from online. And the second is basically one of the many candidate electric vehicles that is available for purchase. Both of these are trying to solve a problem. And the problem that they're trying to solve is the question of burning fossil fuels, right? And you can ask the question, well, I've converted from doing one kind of thing, which is burning fossil fuels, to doing another kind of thing, which is burning nuclear fuel. Am I burning nuclear fuel at the best possible? Am I being the most efficient about it? Maybe maybe this is something that I should pay attention to, because otherwise I'll be here back again in 100 years, and all of the civilization, between now and 100 years from now, would be depressed by the realization that we've been burning nuclear fuel in various countries in very inefficient ways, and now we wasted another resource that we should not have wasted, or we've polluted our environment in some other funny way that we should not have done. So, so maybe the question of efficiency is relevant. It's relevant to basically minimizing our carbon footprint. It's relevant to basically just doing things in the most fair possible way, in the most energy and resource efficient way. And likewise, you might want to ask the exact same question about the electric car, perhaps, because it's not good enough that you just drive an electric vehicle. It solves some problem, but it doesn't solve all problems. If the electric vehicle does not basically offset the carbon footprint that is required to make the electric vehicle over its own lifetime and then some more, it's actually not a net carbon neutral object. And this is something that you would want to pay attention to. And one way in which you can impact this question is basically by asking the question, how efficiently does this car run? Maybe if I make it super efficient, then it crosses the threshold before its lifetime runs out. Maybe it delivers more to me than I've allowed it to deliver. And there are some formulas on the wall. I don't want to at all scare you with them, but the top formula represents, for instance, a theoretical limit. So if you think of a nuclear power plant, a nuclear power plant is nothing more than a heat engine, basically, because all that it does is it has a hot temperature and a cold temperature, and it spins some wheels, and those spinning wheels generate electricity. Now, the heat that the hot temperature is that I refer to is coming from nuclear fuel, but this is an irrelevant detail for us. And so, typically, what happens is that what is represented in the upper equation is the theoretical efficiency for some numbers that I just pulled out of a hat. So the theoretical efficiency, let's say, is 50%. The actual operational efficiency of most nuclear power plants that people have noticed across the world is a slightly modified formula. It's called the Curzon-Albon limit. And so, but for all practical purposes, what it means is that you expect that you should theoretically be able to do no better than 50%. And this is a number that's good to know, because then you're not stressing yourself out trying to aim for 70%. You should only aim for 50%. And most practical heat engines do as well as 30%. So the Kudungaram nuclear plant on a good day does, let's say, 30%. And what that means is that there is still a 20% gap that you can hope to recover by being more careful about the way that you're operating the machine. And if you can't get close to the 50%, understand why, right? So these kinds of questions about the ultimate limits of things are important, not just because we're trying to push technology and make somehow cool devices and so on and so, all of which we are, but also because it relates to basically cleaning up our act as a civilization. It's just living the most efficient life possible, so that we're not stressing out the resources of the earth that we live on, right? And so another reason that you would want to care about this question is this example that I've put in front of you, which is think of basically addition as an exercise. You can add practically as long a number as you would ever care to add on just a Casio machine. You would need nothing more than that. But there are people who build these very, very complicated looking supercomputers. So this is the Blue Gene supercomputer. And why do they do it? What's the real reason that they're doing it, right? And this has to do with answering the question about the ultimate limits of computation, but with a different mindset. And that's to basically push computation to its very ultimate limits, and to be able to calculate things that are really almost at the border of our reach of computational capacity. And so these are also the other reasons that we would be interested in these questions, because it allows us to tackle problems that are bigger and bigger than the ones that we've tackled in the past. And to know where the boundary of these things is a good place for us to go park ourselves as scientists and engineers, and so that we push on those boundaries little by little, and then we find what's on the other side. Yeah. Okay. So with this, I hope to be done in another 5 or 10 minutes. Let me just tell you what the rules are, or how you would go about it without kind of really doing the too much of the maths. The first, I've given you some names of very, very famous thought leaders in the field for you to look up. The first is basically you abstract out the machine, right? So this is the point that I've been making for the last 35 minutes, which is there is a way in which you have to basically just take out all of the details, unnecessary details of the machine, keep only the essential details of the machine, and then talk about it. So here is one way to think about a universal computer. A universal computer you can think of as basically a tape which holds an answer, which holds a computation that you're doing in it, some sort of information that you have, that you're trying to process and store. And then you have something that's like a moving CPU that basically reads and writes to different elements of it. And it can access multiple elements and can do kind of stuff to it. And there are physical models of this built here as well. So this basically is the work by Alan Turing. And what he did was basically construct one of the many, this is not the only, but one of the many universal computational machines that exist out there that allow you to abstract out all possible computers. So now, instead of talking about my semiconductor computer versus your vacuum tube computer versus a third person's abacus, you could just toss all of that out and just talk about the universal classical computer, which is given by this, which is a tape plus something that's on top of it that essentially writes to the tape. And this model can be used mathematically to study computation as a kind of primitive. And so that's one thing that I just want to share with you. The other is basically once you have these universalizing universalizing models, so a model like this, which basically takes out the details of the specific computer that you're interested in and abstracts it out into an abstract computer that can then be mapped back to any computer that you would be interested in. What you can do is you can ask what the universal rules that emerge from that universal machine are. And in a different context, this was answered by Claude Shannon. Again, this is for communication, and you can do this kind of activity and you can pursue this kind of activity, and the answers that are presented to you by these gentlemen would be very illuminating in this area. Okay, so let me give you in the next 5 or so minutes a really, really bad summary of the way to think about difficult and easy problems and to kind of set you up for quantum computing. So the analysis that people presented basically is all summarized into something called the big O notation. And so this is just a phrase. If you Google the phrase big O, it produces all of the right results that you can then read. And let me just tell you what it is. It basically says that, look, don't sweat the details. So suppose you have basically a problem that you're trying to solve. The size of the problem is n. So in this case, it's basically some relationship to how much you're trying to read and write on this tape here, basically, right? It's the size of the input of the problem that you're giving. For instance, if you're trying to factorize a number, it's basically the size of this input size of on the number itself that you're giving. If you're trying to ask, if you're trying to break a password, right? So you have to give me I'm some sort of an electronic lock, and you have to give me a number, and the number is basically the password. And if you've guessed it correctly, I let you in. Then it's the size of the password. Is it 32 digits long? 64 digits long? How big is the password? That kind of size of the number of digits that you have to supply or that you're trying to manipulate is the size n. And on the y-axis is the amount of time or the amount of spatial resources. I'm being vague about it. Actually, it is both. But let's just say the spatial resources. Let's say time, that amount of time that it takes to solve the problem. And there are various kinds of problems here. There are various kinds of scalings that you can imagine. So you can imagine that I have certain problems where if you double the size of the input, then the amount of time that it takes to solve it doubles, right? So these are linear problems basically. And in fact, things like addition are like this. This is the reason why you can take your Casio calculator and you can add like two large 30 digit, 50 digit, 100 digit numbers with ease basically. So long as the Casio calculator's memory doesn't overflow, you basically, there's no problem basically, right? There may be problems that are slightly more difficult than that, but that basically just grow quadratically, which means if you double the size of the input, so the size of the input in the case of addition is just the total, the size of the numbers that you're inputting, two numbers that you're trying to add, the bigger of the two, let's say. Whereas the quadratic are basically the variety of problems where if you double the size of the input, so if I go from a 30 digit input to a 60 digit input, the amount of time doesn't grow to double the value, it doesn't double, but it grows as a quadratic, so it squares, right? So it grows 4 times, let's say. And then there are these exponential problems, which means that very, very quickly by a small number n, you need a large amount of time to solve this problem, right? So if you had a constant time constraint on this axis, so let me just draw an imaginary line here. You can see that the amount of exponential problems that you can solve is smaller in size than the quadratic or linear, but if you're far enough away, the quadratic will always dominate over the linear. So this is a kind of nice classification because it tells you these are difficult problems, these are easier problems, these are super easy problems, right? And then there may be even things that are smaller than this. And in fact, in the computer science parlance, they actually don't care about all of these. There's just a cut here between exponential problems and sub-exponential problems. And the kind of exponential problems are especially difficult. And once you understand that they're especially difficult, you can use them to basically store secrets and do all kinds of crazy things because you know that this is a very difficult problem to hack. And because it's a very difficult problem to hack, it's a perfect place for you to hide secrets. Yeah. So that's the kind of benefit that comes out of this kind of analysis. If you push on this even more, and if you took a course on computer science or looked this up before, then the big O basically has more formal structure to it. It's something called a computational complexity zoo, and the computational complexity zoo basically classifies this into problems that are easy and problems that may be difficult and problems that are definitely difficult and so on and so forth. And I highlight to you that there is this equals question mark here, question mark equals here, and this simply is a statement in computer science about the proofs not being suggestive but not being not being known for a fact. So there is some technical bit here which I just want to avoid for this small discussion, but this has some potent meaning about basically whether or not this claim is a hypothesis or a real proof. And it's a hypothesis, and that's the reason why there is a question mark there, which means tomorrow somebody can come and say, no, these two problems are not separated from each other in difficulty, they're equally difficult, and and then you would have to change this boundary basically. Okay, so to summarize, what I've done is basically walked you through some kind of everyday examples, hopefully, and kind of given you the flavor of how you can think of abstracting out from simple problems, but concrete problems which are of your interest to you, up to basically something where you have something like a big O notation which abstracts out all of these ideas and gives you kind of computational toolboxes to think about the difficulty of problems, right? And you have to go all the way here before you ask the question about the ultimate limits, right? So this is basically the central point I want to make. So how do you ask the question about ultimate limits, right? So let's think of the most ultimate object that we can think of in the universe, which is a black hole. And here is a real picture of it from the Event Horizon Telescope. Black holes represent an area of the universe where gravity and quantum mechanics are both simultaneously considered to answer the questions that come out of there, right? So this is just to pique your interest. I mean, nothing that I say or do is directly related to black holes, even though I think a little bit about them. But the central point here is basically that physicists, the only point I want you to take away from this is that physicists for the last 100+ years have been worrying themselves about the ultimate limits of everything. What happens if you push something really, really small? What happens if you take a lot of energy and pack it into a place, right? These are the questions that we've been asking forever and a day. And so the ultimate hardware limits of the universe are actually dictated by us. And this is exactly the central point that I want to make, which is up until now, what you have been seeing is basically the software rules of the universe, So what Claude Shannon and Alan Turing and all of those other folks did was basically write down and in an abstract fashion the most general rules of the software of the universe. But in doing so, they made a crucial assumption. And the crucial assumption is they made their physical model of the tape as bits, which means that they are little tiny zeros and ones, and that's all that they can be. They're little bullets, and the bullets can either be can either be red colored or black colored, right? So these are binary choices. They're sealed. They're set in stone, and all you can do is manipulate these bullets. And this produced basically this complexity zoo for you. What I want to challenge you on is that that's actually not the ultimate universe or theory of the universe. And if you actually ask what the ultimate theory of the universe is, then quantum mechanics emerges as the correct answer. And this would then modify what is being said on this slide about the ultimate limits of computation, right? So this in one sentence is the summary of what quantum computer science is. Quantum computer science and quantum information theory modify or correct basically the underlying physical model of the universe, which is not ultimate, and replaces it with the correct ultimate physical model of the universe, and hence produces the correct ultimate physical model of computation and of information transfer, right? So let me show you in a couple of minutes this analysis in basically again in pictures and analogies. So bits are basically, what did I just say about them? I said they're zeros or ones. They're like bullets. They're just stuck in place. They're either black or red. They're zeros or ones. Right? They're just two binary, a binary choice. And once you've made it, it's there. We think of electrons when we think of children and we're going through school. We think of electrons like that as well. Because if I shoot electrons or bullets from a gun, then on the screen it comes and hits some place, right? Think of just a little BB gun and a paper screen, right? It impacts on the screen somewhere. And hence you think of these bullets as basically, these electrons in this case, as little bullets flying and then hitting the screen. So for reasons that I will show you in another slide, people set up this question of what's called the double slit experiment. So they said, let's imagine that there are two slits, and I shoot these electrons from an electron gun. If they are bullets, they either pick the left slit or the right slit, and they travel through and hit the screen somewhere. And so I expect to see two little bumps, one behind the left slit and one behind the right slit. What do I actually see? And what you actually see is already on the wall. The reason they set up this question is to contrast this against waves, right? So this is an example of what happens if I drop two marbles into water, or if into a still lake. Then what happens is that the two marbles create disturbance, and these disturbances basically come and meet each other at crests and troughs, and they either cancel each other. The crest meets a trough and it cancels each other, or two crests meet and two troughs meet and they reinforce each other. And this is basically what you see as a pattern, right? So if you were sitting here if you had a paper boat here, the paper boat would undulate up and down even more than it did previously, because there are two marbles which hit and their energies have combined. So the question that people were asking here was basically, this is a disturbance, this is a disturbance. Do these two disturbances interfere on the back end or not? They would not interfere if you think of these electrons as bullets, and they would indeed interfere if the electrons were not bullets and they were waves, right? And the central proof here is this experiment. I just want to try and play this video. Okay, so the video won't play. Yeah, okay. So let me just show you what this is. These are single electrons that are leaving an electron gun. This is an experiment done by Hitachi in 1989. This single electrons leaving an electron gun on a two-slit experiment. The electrons leave one at a time. And when one electron is traveling through the tube, it takes like 10 milliseconds or something. There is no second electron in the machine. So at any given point, there's only one electron, and the electron travels from the gun to the screen and impinges itself on the screen. So you can ask the question, are electrons like bullets? And if electrons are like bullets, I expect these two bands in the back, which are consistent with just two bullet lines forming. What you see is basically an entire interference pattern, what you see is you see these banded structures back and forth, back and forth. This banded structure is more in line with this kind of interferometric structure. This is just in 2D space, whereas that is just on a flat line, right? So this is happening in free space all around you, whereas this is just happening on the back wall, and that's the reason why it's flat. But otherwise, it's exactly the same. So this interference basically is happening for one electron at a time, right? So the most mind-blowing thing about this, I want you to understand that this is literally the most mind-blowing experiment in my mind in the last 100 years. This and its cousins is basically it answers the question, right? This age-old Buddhist question: if a tree falls in the forest and there's no one there to hear it, did it even fall? Right? Did it make a sound? Sorry. If a tree falls in the forest and there's no one there to hear it, did it make a sound? And what that question has to do with this question is basically it's asking the question: if an electron left an electron gun and you saw it on the screen, was it a bullet-like object while it was traveling, or was it a wave-like object while it was traveling? And there's only one of them ever. This is vacuum, exactly one electron. There are no two electrons for them to talk to each other. There's only one electron. And what basically quantum mechanics says is the correct answer I put in front of you is it says unperformed experiments do not have outcomes. You're not allowed to ask this question. This question is actually technically illegal for you to ask. And this technical illegality basically exhibits itself as an entire modification of the theory of physics. So about 100 years ago, if you would have asked someone, how do you think of electrons or protons or neutrons or the moon, they would have said, well, I think of them as little particles or big particles, just particles of different sizes. That entire picture basically is fully thrown out the window and replaced by something else. And that something else can actually undergo superposition. And this is basically the central story that I want to tell you. So the ultimate model of the universe, quote unquote, is the one which accommodates the Young's double slit experiment, the experiment that I just showed you. And the way that it's mathematically represented is like this. So it says, before you saw it, the electron traveled both through the left slit and the right slit. This is one way of interpreting what these symbols mean that is in front of you. And why is this important, or of what relevance is this to computation? Is basically when you're trying to make a computation, you're asking the question, what is some function? This function may be the key that checks whether your password is correct. This function could be the foundational function whose answer allows you to design a drug. This function could be the question to a financial instrument that you want to bet on. And so this function can take the answer 0 or can take the answer 1. Of course, it can take a million different inputs, but let's just consider just the 0 or 1. What quantum mechanics allows you to do, because it allows the superposition, this coexistence of possibilities, is that it can actually search for both of these answers at once. And because it can search for various different answers at once, this is called quantum parallelism. Because of this, what it allows you to do is it allows you to speed up the search space that you're trying to search through. That's the foundational key here. Yeah. Okay, so just a last 1 or 2 slides. I don't mean for you to do anything or take away anything from this. What I do with these things, just as a kind of point of interest, common interest between you and I, is that I use this for things that basically are, this is called quantum control, but to put it in common parlance, it's basically used to search for chemical designs. So if I wanted to design a better drug or so on and so forth, this is the kind of machinery that I would go through, and this is just using these principles that I've just laid in front of you over the last hour, out to fruition. You can do other things with this, like I use it actually to store energy. So this is some coverage of some very old work that I did on how to store energy inside batteries using quantum mechanical principles, and you can do it better, and there are some advantages there. And if you, I'm actually something that's, it's a research that I've been doing over the last 10 years. So this is the most recent version of it that is still unpublished, that's in review. But this is another battery which does something funny, which I'm happy to talk about offline. I also use it to create really exotic instruments that don't have any classical analogy. So this is a little bit like a like an entanglement switch. So you can either sweep voltage or you can sweep temperature, and this entire machine basically spits out um, uh, complicated states of light, complicated states of electron states actually. And so what it is it's a modern version of a quantum engine. So a classical engine, uh, the ones that I showed you in the previous slides, convert heat to mechanical work, whereas this converts heat to a completely different kind of object that we've never even considered before. And these are the kinds of things that you could do with this, right? So this is just to kind of excite you about the future. And okay, so I'm at the 55-minute mark. I'll stop now. Next time, what I'll do is I'll try and walk through two examples, basically cartoon examples that have something to do with drug design and maybe something to do with finance, and maybe that's something that'll excite you. So thank you very much. I'm happy to take questions.
Right. Thank you, sir, for kind of running us through.
You're muted, Vidu.
Am I? Is this working now? Hello?
Yeah.
Does this work now? I was just saying thank you, sir, for kind of running us through this, and um it was really interesting because at various stages you brought in perhaps the civilizational kind of understanding of technology, and then kind of a bringing in Buddhist interpretation, and then tying that back with technology. So that actually works quite well for anyone who trying to kind of make sense of what we're doing. Um, but yes, now we are open to questions. The question window is open for anybody who would like to post them. Um, but perhaps I can start with one, which is when we talk about critical and emerging technologies. So you talk about some of the exciting things that are happening, and you showed some of your work. Are there implicitly different challenges that come when you're talking about designing technologies on quantum principles?
Yeah, yeah, very much. So the deepest problem with quantum technologies is that they're very, very, very susceptible to heat and noise, and so you need really, really quiet systems for you to be able to see quantum mechanical behavior. And once you access that universe, it allows you all of this kind of space to search through problems in ways that you have not been able to before. Again, I want to say that there are caveats here. It doesn't help. It almost helps. The set of problems that it helps is very limited, and this has to be, this is one of the many kind of common misunderstandings, that you can't check your Gmail any faster because of quantum computers. It's a very niche area of things that it's good at. But the technical hardware issues with designing quantum technologies all have to do with the fact that they require very, very stringent demands on cooling. So
Hmm.
just to give you an example, some quantum computing architectures require 30 millikelvin, 60 millikelvin, things of that sort. So just to give your the viewers here, the listeners here, some context for it, room temperature is whatever, 30 degrees centigrade, right? It's about 300 Kelvin. And if you take outer space, like if you just go out into outer space and actually go towards nothing and just keep traveling towards nothing, and after a while where you're just more or less completely alone around you, there's no sun, there's no radio, you can only see the sun as a distant dot. You're at around 2.7 Kelvin. 300 Kelvin's room temperature, 3 Kelvin is the middle of outer space. We need our labs to be between 100 and 1,000 times colder than that, times colder than that. Not right. I mean, this is just an insane amount of coldness that you have to produce. So it requires a tremendous amount of work to actually evacuate all of the stuff from it, and then it has to be in a very, very pristine condition for you to. So the hardware challenges are several. One, from a kind of broad principles perspective, you have to have not have them either too hot or too noisy, and this is essentially 90% of the work there. And also the fact that quantum mechanics has a lot more possibility space, whatever this sentence means, means that the electronics that you need to control them needs to be much more numerous. And this adds additional complexity because every time you run a wire to anything, anyone who's done any electronics, even in high school, knows that that wire is going to have voltage or current, and that thing's going to just be jiggling all over the place and creating noise of its own. So all wires that are going in are sources of noise and heat. So you both need a ton of wires, and you also can't take any noise or heat. So managing this is very tricky business basically. And to scale it all up to an industrial to an industrial level requires all kinds of additional at scale processes that are not things that you would consider, so if I was to make rotis for dinner, like, for my family, I'd make like 10 rotis and I'd stop. But it's a completely different story if I'm like, the local restaurant that's making 5,000 rotis every day, right? I just couldn't do the same thing that I would do for making 10 rotis and make 5,000, and still be alive at the end of the day. So the to at scale manufacturing always has its own consequential problems that you have to deal with.
So we have questions in the chat, but I actually want to kind of talk about that last element that you were mentioning, because here we kind of work um, with foreign policy and policy related things at Ananta. So I had a very brief question, which is very often we hear a lot of excitement about quantum technologies as in, we talk about how data is the new oil and how technologies, quantum computing is going to solve all of our problems in being able to uh, compute this data and kind of develop these models, DPIs, etc. Um, so at a national level, kind of what you were talking about, when you bring in these challenges, what does it look like nationally? Like, how are these technologies perhaps being developed nationally? Where is kind of the conversation between academics and policy?
There is I mean, I would say that, let me be a bit critical here because I can be, I guess, I can get away being critical. What I would say is twofold. One is that the government has put in some amount of money recently. So let me begin with the positive note, which is, there's some 6,000 odd crores that are on the line for a national quantum mission. And it explicitly demands industrial participation along with academic activity. So, the technology transfer route is more or less spelt out, and so let's see if that works out. But the broader context, I would say, from a policy point of view for India as a whole, as a nation, is basically, I think our industrial friends have been too reluctant to basically invest in emerging deep technologies for 40 plus years now, and this we are missing the bus constantly because of this. And this is something that at a policy level needs correction, but also at the end of the day is just something that look, IBM, Google have invested in quantum technologies before anyone knew that this would work out, and it's still not very clear if it will work out, right? In fact, Google has recently put out a price saying that if you can prove basically something that is of commercial interest and deep human interest, then we'll give you money, blah blah blah. The details of the thing are around, but my point is that even if the question is unsure, oftentimes kind of industrial leaders around the world have invested money, whereas our own domestic industrial partners are more reluctant, and this is something that just needs to be openly said out loud because. This is one of the kind of new industrial avenues that has come up, and we're already a bit slow on it, and but presumably there are others that will come up. There may be a bio revolution that comes up, and if you're going to wait for it to really start off before, if you another 15 years or 20 years later people start saying, hey, maybe we should think about CRISPR, that's too late. I mean, we're already too late, but I mean, 20 years from now is again too late, right? So, I end with this kind of Chinese proverb I learned at some point, which is, the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, and the second best time is now. We have to kind of somehow convince our industrial partners to invest in planting the tree, and that means investing in deep tech that they don't hope to see return on investment for 20 years. And this is just, I invite you to correct me and tell me where of an example where deep tech was invested this kind of 20-year deep tech investment exists in India. I can't think of an example. And so that's where I would say the gaps are, right? Let me also just add one last thing, which is that there is also a coexisting area, which is semiconductor devices, which also needs to kind of be at a mature stage for quantum computing to kind of really kick off at any level. There is a semiconductor mission as well that's kicked off. So governmental policy, at least now, I would say, is aligned more or less in the right place that it should be. But if I was to prosecute the historical wrongs, I would say we've been too slow on all of this, and we need to correct this. But the slowness more so, I would say, from an industrial point of view, because if you see all of the thought leaders and the world leaders on quantum technologies in the US and Europe, they're all companies. Almost all of them are companies. And so people have really taken money out of their pocket and put it on something, and they're willing to take that risk for a 20-year period. Yeah.
No, quite right. Whenever we look at perhaps private and government R&D in India, we consistently see that the numbers aren't really there. Um, Jayesh had a question, and perhaps you'll speak more about this in the next one. But he asks, when we evaluate models that are probabilistic in nature, such as the open pricing model,
Black
financial
Scholes.
option pricing model, such as Black and Scholes model, can we make such analysis better through quantum assessment?
Yeah. So let me just say, probabilistic, trying to answer, there are two questions here. One is basically, I can think of the thing that I'm trying to simulate as a stochastic object, so something that has inherently noise built into it, and hence I would like to simply simulate many instances of it, and extract data from that. This already happens. I mean, we do this in quantum all the time. We're experts at this as well. Now, and then there is a second question of basically, maybe I want to, I have something that is a random process, but I want to know when it crosses a certain threshold so that I can make some sort of promise on average, worst case, blah blah blah. And this as well, there are promises, but this is a different, you have to separate these two questions and ask them separately. And the answer is yes to both, basically. So there are ways in which, let me not even talk about stochastic differential equations. Let me just talk about partial differential equations, to kind of just inform the Jayesh of the thing, which is that if you have, even in terms of kind of doing things like linear regression, so on and so forth, but also something as complicated as differential equation simulations, there are lots of kind of modern quantum computing techniques that have shown advantages of how you could actually simulate this faster and better on a quantum computer. So adding noise is not a problem. Inherent simulating noise is not a problem. And in fact, in all of these kind of probabilistic models, it does as well as everything else does. At least as well as everything else does. This is one good thing to remember, which is that a quantum computer uses all of the resources that a classical computer uses, and then it's something more on top of it. So it can't be worse. I mean, at least in principle, can't be worse than a classical computer. In practice, is many times much worse than a classical computer, because the technology is new, and so we don't know how to integrate the resources in some fair way. But this is just a growing pains issue, basically. In another, let's say, 30 years time or whatever, when you have modern mature quantum computers, you'd be able to switch between a classical and quantum solution very easily. And oftentimes, even now we benchmark our quantum solutions against classical solutions.
Right, right. With that, I think we've slightly overshot also. So maybe we can close this for today and then keep the conversation going in the next one. So if it's fine, I'll just close now. So thank you, sir, for giving us this lecture today, and
Thank
kind
you
of
very much.
laying out uh, the broad base for quantum mechanics, kind of making sure that all of us are on the same page in terms of understanding what it looks like, what the prospects look like, what the challenges look like. Thank you for joining, everyone, in this fifth edition of the Masterclass series. This was the third lecture that we organized, second for the first one for quantum mechanics. And we will be back on the 26th, same time at 4 p.m. to discuss slightly more and discuss about examples of quantum mechanics with drug design and finance. Once again, this series is supported through the generous support of Triveni Turbines Limited. Thank you so much for joining, and good evening.
Thank you, everyone.